The deepest, darkest part of a pond is exactly where you should stop casting when the fishing gets tough. Most bank anglers assume that when the pressure is on and the bite completely shuts down, bass push out into the absolute deepest hole they can find to escape the threat and hide. But that assumption ignores the basic biology of small bodies of water and the severe physical limitations of the fish themselves. There are three things this video covers. Why the most barren, featureless stretch of mudbank actually holds the most aggressive fish. How a microscopic change in bottom composition dictates positioning better than any massive piece of wood, and what a steady afternoon wind is doing to an invisible layer of water right in front of you. None of this requires a boat, and none of it requires expensive electronics to figure out. According to pond management data published by the Texas A&M Agri-Life Extension, water deeper than 4 to 6 feet in small, unmanaged ponds often becomes completely anoxic during the warmer months. This happens because of a very specific biological process called thermal stratification. During the peak heat of summer, a pond naturally divides into 3 distinct thermal layers. The top layer, called the epilimnion, remains warm and highly oxygenated by surface wind action and the photosynthesis of aquatic plants. The middle layer, known as the metalimnion or the thermocline, features a rapid, drastic drop in water temperature. The bottom layer, the hypolimnion, becomes cold, dense, and is completely sealed off from the surface oxygen. In a small pond without artificial aeration systems to mix the water column, this deep bottom layer quickly loses its dissolved oxygen, dropping to levels that simply cannot sustain vertebrate life. A largemouth bass that swims down into this deep zone will literally suffocate within minutes. The fish are not hiding out in the deep water because they physically cannot breathe there. They are sitting right at your feet, in shallow water, using features so subtle they do not even create a ripple on the surface. Common sense in bass fishing dictates that you should always target highly visible structure. We are taught from day one to look for large fallen trees, concrete drain pipes, thick weed beds, and overhanging bushes. In a large, sprawling lake with miles of shoreline, this logic holds up perfectly. But a small pond is a highly confined environment, and visual structure is usually extremely limited. If a pond only has one prominent fallen tree on the entire shoreline, every single person who walks that bank is going to cast a lure at it. That specific tree gets bombarded with spinnerbaits, crankbaits, and heavy plastic worms 7 days a week, woodchows, week after week. The fish living in that pond do not lack intelligence. They are simply conditioned by basic survival instincts to associate that highly visible structure with the constant threat of being caught. The obvious visual cover becomes a high danger zone, causing the mature, experienced bass to abandon it entirely during daylight hours. They do not stop feeding, and they do not leave the area completely. They simply migrate to secondary, invisible structures that the average bank angler walks right past without a second glance. This explains exactly why the angler who spends an hour throwing perfectly placed casts into the tangled branches of a laydown goes home empty-handed, while someone dragging a bait through open, seemingly empty water suddenly connects with a giant fish. The error is not in the lure choice, the color of the bait, or the presentation. The error is in trusting your eyes over the actual hydrodynamics and biology of the pond. To understand how these highly pressured fish operate, we are going to look at one specific, boring stretch of bare mudbank and break down exactly why it is the most valuable piece of real estate in the water. Imagine a completely barren shoreline. There is no wood, there are no rocks, and there is absolutely no vegetation breaking the surface. It just looks like a flat, muddy slope slowly disappearing into the murky, featureless water. Most anglers will take one courtesy cast parallel to the bank, reel it in as fast as possible, and keep walking toward the nearest visible target. But if you systematically dissect this seemingly empty water, you will find layers of invisible structure that govern exactly where a bass will set up an ambush. The first layer is the microdepression. A bass is an apex ambush predator, and to ambush prey efficiently without expending unnecessary energy, it requires a defined edge. In a heavily pressured pond, that edge does not need to be a giant boulder or a massive submerged stump. It only needs to be a slight depression or a shallow trough running parallel to the shoreline. Imagine the bottom is generally 2 feet deep, but right in the middle of this bare bank, there is a subtle trench where the depth drops to exactly 30 inches. A 6-inch difference in depth sounds completely insignificant to a human standing high above the water. But to a creature that hovers just off the bottom, a 6-inch vertical drop is a physical wall. It provides a necessary break in the current, a specific place to hide their profile from passing prey, and a highly defined physical line to pin baitfish against when they attack. Largemouth bass possess a highly evolved sensory organ called the lateral line system, consisting of pores running down the side of their body filled with specialized sensory cells called neuromasts. These neuromasts detect minute particle displacement and very low-frequency vibrations in the water column. When water currents flow over a flat, uniform mud bottom, the hydrodynamic signature is entirely smooth. But when that same water flows over a 6-inch vertical drop, it creates microscopic turbulence and highly distinct pressure changes. The bass can feel this hydrodynamic interruption through its lateral line from several yards away, easily locating the edge even in heavily stained water with zero visibility. You cannot see this microdrop from above the surface, but you can map it with extreme precision by dragging a heavy, compact lure, like a bare Texas-rigged tungsten weight. As you drag the weight slowly across the bottom, keeping your rod tip low, the rod will be loaded with a steady, consistent tension. When the weight slowly crosses the lip of that 6-inch trough, the line will suddenly go completely slack for a fraction of a second before the weight hits the new bottom. If you feel that momentary slack in your line, you have successfully found the first layer of the puzzle. But a slight depression alone is not enough to hold a fish consistently, which brings us to the second layer of this bare bank. Bottom composition. A bare mud bank is rarely composed of uniform, soft silt from end to end. Over years of heavy rain runoff, subtle wave action, and wind erosion, the lighter, softer silt gets washed away in highly specific patches, exposing the harder clay, sand, or gravel underneath. This transition line from soft muck to hard bottom is the most critical holding area in a shallow pond. Research conducted by the University of Florida Institute of Food and Agricultural Sciences indicates that largemouth bass actively avoid resting over soft, highly organic muck for prolonged periods. The biological reason for this is that the natural decomposition of organic matter in the muck consumes localized dissolved oxygen, creating a microlayer of extremely poor water quality right on the bottom. Bass prefer to rest and feed over hard substrates like clay or gravel, where the oxygen levels remain highly stable and where bottom-dwelling prey, like crawfish, are heavily concentrated. To successfully map this transition, you cannot use standard monofilament line, which stretches significantly and absorbs the delicate vibrations. You must use a dense metal like a tungsten sinker paired with low-stretch fluorocarbon line, creating a direct, taut acoustic connection to your graphite rod blank. When the tungsten weight is dragging through the soft, decaying muck, the organic matter absorbs all the kinetic energy. The vibration is entirely dampened, and your rod tip feels completely mushy and dead, almost as if you're pulling a heavy wet sponge through the water. But the exact instant that tungsten weight slides off the soft muck and strikes the hard, clean clay, the kinetic energy spikes dramatically. The sharp acoustic vibration travels straight up the taut fluorocarbon line, through the guides, and directly into your hand, feeling like a sharp, distinct tap. When you find a specific spot where a 6-inch microdepression actively intersects with the transition from soft mud to hard clay, you have located a high percentage holding zone. However, simply locating the resting zone is only part of the equation, because the fish will not actively feed there unless the environment naturally brings the food directly to them. This introduces the third critical layer of the bare bank: the wind undertow. Look closely at the surface of the pond before you cast and note the exact direction of the wind. Common fishing knowledge dictates that wind pushes surface water, and that surface water carries baitfish and hatching insects toward the wind-blown bank. This is entirely true, but it only tells half of the complex hydrodynamic story occurring in the pond. When a steady, continuous wind pushes a massive volume of surface water against a bare shoreline, that water cannot simply pile up on the dry land. Physics dictates that the massive volume of water must displace somewhere, and it does so by cycling downward and creating a powerful reverse undertow that flows directly along the bottom, moving away from the bank and back out toward the deeper center of the pond. This invisible, flowing bottom current acts as a massive conveyor belt for the entire local ecosystem. It slowly pulls dead insects, stunned baitfish, microscopic zooplankton, and disoriented crawfish away from the extremely shallow edges and drags them forcefully over the drop-offs. A mature, intelligent bass understands this mechanical flow perfectly and positions itself nose first directly against this bottom undertow. It hovers right on the hard clay transition, utilizing the 6-inch depression to comfortably break the current, simply waiting for the undertow to deliver the helpless food directly over the ledge and right into its mouth. If you casually cast straight out from the bank directly into the wind and drag your lure back toward your feet, you're moving the bait aggressively against the natural flow of the undertow. You're forcing the lure to approach the base rapidly from behind, which looks highly unnatural and will almost always startle a heavily pressured fish. The correct approach is to position yourself carefully on the shoreline so that you can cast perfectly parallel to the bank, casting past the target zone and allowing your heavy bottom lure to sweep naturally with the reverse bottom current. You have now identified the precise depth change, located the hard clay transition, and aligned your presentation perfectly with the natural wind undertow. Most bank anglers strongly believe that once you find these three elements intersecting in one single spot, you're absolutely guaranteed to catch fish. But there is one final, overriding variable that dictates everything else, and it is the single biological reason why you can fish this perfect microstructure meticulously at 10 in the morning and catch absolutely nothing, only to return to the exact same spot at 4 in the afternoon and effortlessly pull out the biggest bass in the pond. That critical variable is the exact angle of the sun hitting the water column. A simple 6-inch drop on the bottom does not provide any overhead cover to protect a base from birds of prey. Nor does it create a large, obvious shadow like a massive fallen tree or a wooden dock. But as the day slowly progresses and the sun gradually dips lower on the horizon, the trajectory of the light penetrating the water begins to shift dramatically. At a very specific hour in the late afternoon, the angle of the intense sunlight hits that 6-inch vertical ledge perfectly and casts a microscopic 3-inch shadow straight across the hard clay bottom. Extensive biological studies on the visual sensory systems of centrarchids, the family that includes largemouth bass, reveal that their eyes entirely lack the rapid pupillary response mechanisms naturally found in mammals. It takes a bass significantly longer to physically adjust to sudden shifts from extremely dark to extremely bright environments compared to the smaller, highly reactive baitfish they prey upon.